World War II wasn't just a war between soldiers. Behind the battlefields was another massive battle over factories: oil, steel, food, money, and production. And in the end, economic power would become one of the most important weapons of all. By the late 1930s, the world was still recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment was high and international trade was weak. But countries like Germany and Japan were rapidly increasing military production, turning their economies toward war. A soldier needs more than a rifle. That rifle requires steel, coal, electricity, machines, and workers. The same is true for tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition. Behind every weapon on the battlefield was an enormous economic system. When war began, factories changed their purpose. Automobile plants started producing military trucks and engines. Other factories switched to tanks, ammunition, and aircraft. The goal was no longer normal consumer production. It was maximum wartime output. The United States had an enormous industrial advantage. Its factories, workers, natural resources, and transportation networks could produce weapons on a massive scale. America eventually supplied not only its own military, but also many of its allies. American factories used assembly line production to dramatically increase output. Aircraft and vehicles were broken into hundreds of specialized steps. Each worker focused on one task, while machines kept the production line moving faster and faster. But massive production required massive amounts of money. Governments relied on taxes, borrowing, government spending, and other financial tools to pay for the war. Money flowed from the financial system directly into factories and military supply chains. Ordinary Americans also became part of the war financing system. The government sold war bonds and encouraged citizens to buy them. Millions of people effectively lent their money to the government, helping finance the enormous cost of military production. Governments also raised taxes and dramatically increased wartime spending. More national income was directed toward military production. Civilian consumption was reduced, while factories received huge government contracts to produce weapons and supplies. But having money didn't mean you could buy unlimited goods. Food, gasoline, rubber, and metals became scarce. Governments introduced rationing, limiting how much people could purchase so that critical resources could be reserved for the military. Millions of men entered military service, but factories still needed workers. Women moved into industrial jobs in huge numbers. They worked in aircraft factories, shipyards, ammunition plants, and other industries, helping keep wartime production running. Germany built a powerful military machine, but it faced serious resource limitations. Oil, rubber, and other raw materials were difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. As the war continued, these shortages placed increasing pressure on Germany's economy. Modern armies cannot function without fuel. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and warships all depend on enormous amounts of oil. That made oil fields, refineries, pipelines, and supply routes some of the most valuable strategic targets of World War II. Building a weapon was only half the problem. It also had to reach the battlefield. That required ships, trains, trucks, and fuel. In the Atlantic, attacks on cargo ships showed just how important and vulnerable the global supply chain could be. The United States used the Lend-Lease program to provide allied nations with weapons, vehicles, food, raw materials, and other supplies. American factories became directly connected to battlefields thousands of miles away. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, many Soviet factories were moved away from the front lines. Machines and workers were transported enormous distances. The factories were then rebuilt and production restarted, keeping the Soviet war machine supplied. Japan had a powerful military, but its industrial base was much smaller than America's. A long war required enormous amounts of fuel, steel, ships, and aircraft. As the conflict continued, this industrial gap became increasingly important. Countries didn't just attack enemy armies. They attacked their economies. Blockades, shipping attacks, railway destruction, and industrial bombing were all designed to reduce an enemy's ability to produce and deliver the supplies needed to keep fighting. Strategic bombing was extremely expensive. Every mission required aircraft, pilots, fuel, bombs, and maintenance. But the goal was to destroy factories, railways, and infrastructure, reducing the enemy's ability to replace weapons and continue the war. World War II transformed entire societies into war economies. Governments, factories, farmers, scientists, transport workers, and ordinary families all became part of the war effort. Resources that once supported civilian life were redirected toward military production. Science became another weapon. Governments invested heavily in radar, cryptography, aviation, medicine, and nuclear research. Scientific knowledge was no longer just about discovery. During the war, it became a form of strategic and economic power, but the economic cost of the war was enormous. Cities, factories, railways, homes, and farmland were destroyed across Europe and Asia. Millions of lives were lost, and rebuilding these damaged economies would require years of work and enormous resources. By the end of the war, America's industrial infrastructure remained largely intact. Its factories had massive production experience, its workforce was highly skilled, and its industrial capacity was enormous. The United States emerged as a dominant global economic power. After the war, the world needed a more stable international economic system. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference helped establish the foundation for new global financial institutions and a new international monetary framework. Europe faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding. Factories were damaged, transportation systems were destroyed, and food supplies were limited. The United States later supported European recovery through the Marshall Plan, helping rebuild production and infrastructure. A soldier on the battlefield never truly fights alone. Behind that soldier are factories, farms, oil fields, steel mills, banks, railways, and supply networks. The strength of the battlefield depends heavily on how efficiently that economic machine can operate. Even a single bullet represents a surprisingly complex supply chain. Metal must be mined, processed, shaped, and transported. Chemicals and machinery are required, and workers must keep the entire process running. A tiny weapon can represent dozens of economic activities. Steel was one of the foundations of modern warfare. Tanks, ships, weapons, railways, and countless other machines depended on it. Countries with strong steel production had a major advantage because they could keep building the equipment needed for a long war. Factories also needed enormous amounts of energy. Coal-powered plants and helped generate electricity for industrial production. Without reliable energy supplies, the machines producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and vehicles simply could not keep running. Armies need food just as much as they need weapons. Farmers produced crops, trucks and trains transported them, and military supply systems delivered them to soldiers. If the food supply breaks down, even a powerful army can lose its ability to fight effectively. Railways were the arteries of the wartime economy. Trains moved soldiers, ammunition, food, coal, fuel, and equipment across enormous distances. That made railway networks incredibly valuable and also important targets for enemy attack. Wartime factories often operated around the clock. Workers worked multiple shifts while machines continuously produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition. Every increase in production could mean more equipment reaching the battlefield. The factory worker became an essential part of the war effort. Their battlefield was the factory floor. Every engine, aircraft, truck, and weapon they produced could directly affect the survival and effectiveness of soldiers on the front lines. War required limited resources to be redirected. Civilian products became harder to find because steel, rubber, fuel, and workers were needed for military production. The result was a dramatic reduction in many types of consumer goods. Every economic decision had a trade-off. Steel used for tanks could not be used for civilian cars. A factory producing military trucks could not produce normal consumer products. In wartime, Every resource had an opportunity cost. Massive government spending combined with limited consumer supplies could create inflation. Demand remained strong while many goods became scarce. Governments responded with price controls, rationing, and other policies designed to keep the wartime economy stable. Whenever goods become scarce and heavily restricted, unofficial markets can appear. During wartime rationing, some scarce products were traded illegally. It was a simple economic response to the gap between strong demand and limited official supply. A tank was far more than a piece of metal. It required steel, an engine, rubber, fuel, machinery, workers, transportation, and maintenance. Its true economic cost included the entire industrial system needed to build and operate it. A fighter aircraft required aluminum engines, specialized equipment, skilled workers, fuel systems, and advanced factories. And after it was built, pilots still needed training, while the aircraft required fuel, repairs, and constant maintenance. Equipment was constantly destroyed on the battlefield. Factories had to replace those losses with new tanks, aircraft, trucks, and weapons. If an economy could replace losses quickly, its military could keep fighting. If it couldn't, every loss became much more dangerous. In a short war, surprise and strategy can be decisive. But as a conflict becomes longer, industrial capacity becomes increasingly important. The ability to continuously produce weapons, fuel, food, and equipment creates enormous economic endurance. When World War II ended, economies had to make another major transition. Factories began moving from military production back toward civilian goods. Soldiers returned home, and countries faced the challenge of rebuilding normal economic life. Across Europe, rebuilding began on an enormous scale. Bridges, railways, factories, homes, and entire cities had to be repaired or reconstructed. The process created millions of jobs and slowly restored economic production. American economic assistance helped deliver food, machinery, and other supplies to Europe. Factories restarted, infrastructure was rebuilt, and production began recovering. Economic reconstruction helped lay the foundation for post-war European growth. World War II teaches a powerful lesson: modern wars are not fought only with soldiers and weapons. They are also fought with production, resources, money, labor, energy, and supply chains. In a long war, economic endurance can become one of the most powerful weapons of all.